What was the scariest we need to leave moment that you've ever experienced? Story 1. My brother and I were kids, playing hide and seek in the front yard of our house. My brother was 3 and I was 6. My brother was supposed to be counting and finding me, but he was taking forever. So I peeked around the side of the house to see what was taking so long. He had lost interest in the game and was standing near the front gate, which led to the street. As I'm looking, I see a brown car pull up with 2 men inside. The car wasn't familiar and neither were the men. They both got out of the car and approached my brother. They started asking him questions and moving closer to him. I remember feeling panicked. I had learned about stranger danger in school and knew this wasn't right. I ran around the side of the house, flew through the back door, and screamed, "Someone is trying to kidnap Steve!" My dad didn't hesitate. He got up and flew through the front door. When the men saw my dad coming through the door, they bolted and peeled out. From that day forward, we weren't allowed to play in the front yard anymore. It's a really scary memory for me. I had a similar experience as a kid, but it was my cousin who saved me. We had a lemonade stand set up at the end of our driveway. It was maybe 3, but my cousin was in her teens and my older brother was also with us. Some weird dude stopped for lemonade. He seemed friendly but made a weird comment about seeing the engine in his car, and tried to get me to come to his car door. My cousin picked me up and ran us right back to the house and my mom. Ironically enough, I lived in a small town and my mom was actually having coffee with one of the local police officers in our home. The guy peeled off before we even got out down to the driveway, but he definitely picked the wrong house that day. When I was 18, some strange couple wanted me to look at their car because supposedly the accelerator wasn't working. I asked them to pop the hood and checked the linkage. All seemed good. The guy who was in the driver's seat kept asking me to go for a test drive with me as a passenger. I told him he could get out and I would feel the accelerator myself. He denied, so I just left. I highly suspect they were up to no good, but I cannot confirm. When I was 13 or 14, I was walking the 7 minutes between my house and my best friend's house. I was walking down one of the main streets between our houses and there was an old man pulled over. He asked me to get in his ute truck and test the accelerator for him. I got a really weird feeling from him and said no and kept walking. He got mad and yelled at me as I rushed off. He might have just wanted help with his car and was just frustrated, but he could have also wanted to get me in his vehicle. It had a bench seat in it, so it would have been easy to shove me over, get in, and take off. There were other cars going past and houses he could have gone to as well. Something I've heard since then is that adults won't ask children for help if they legitimately need it. They'll ask another adult, and that makes 100% sense to me. When I was 5 or 6 or so, I was in my front yard and this car drove up and the driver wanted to know where this street was. I pointed out that it's down there. He asked me where I was. I said, down there, and pointed. It was a side street, so maybe about 100 yards away or so. He asked me where again and told me to come closer to the car and pointed out. At that point, something clicked in my brain and I just screamed, "Daddy!" And that guy peeled off and drove away. Had that happened to me? I was skateboarding on my street and the exact same thing happened. A guy asking where a certain street was. I said, "Somewhere down there," and pointed randomly. He says, "Can you get in and show me?" My dad had given me the full-blown stranger danger talk after a letter got dropped in our letterbox, saying there was a child molester in the street. I started screaming, "Child molester! Child molester! Help! Help!" The guy peeled rubber big time getting out of there. This just brought up a memory I forgot I had. I was young, but not super young, maybe around 10. I was at my friend's house who lived on the street across from my house, which was a dead end. Some maybe 50, 60-year-old lady in a minivan asked us for directions back to the main road. Our neighborhood is kind of confusing. Most side streets lead over to the main road, but 1 or 2 don't. I was very close to her car when telling her where to go. She drove off, and she honestly may have been really lost and needed help. However, my friend's mom caught the end of it, her driving away, and I got in big trouble for walking up to a stranger's car. This happened to me as a kid too. I was maybe 11 or 12. Someone stopped me as I was walking down the street and asked for directions to a school that was like maybe 3 blocks from where I was walking. I gave directions from the sidewalk a couple of times. Go that way, turn left, and it's right there. And the guy acted confused and said he didn't understand, and I would help show him where to go. Luckily, I was absolutely terrified of being kidnapped as a child for unrelated reasons, so I said, "I can't help you anymore," and started walking away. He drove off, but he didn't even attempt to follow my directions. I convinced myself I was just being paranoid at the time, but now as an adult in my 30s, I think it's pretty likely I avoided something very bad. Adults don't stop children for directions. Story 2. Does an "I need to go home now" feeling count? And it wasn't me, but my mom. Anyway, I was around 12 or so, and my mom left to run an errand, leaving me alone. Very soon after she left, the doorbell rang. This was weird because we lived on a hill with only 2 neighbors. We all kept to ourselves, and we just didn't get random visitors. Thanks to some conveniently placed picture frames, I could see out the door without being seen. I looked out and see a young man I don't recognize. He's dressed in a shirt and jeans, and something just feels off. So I ignore him and wait for him to leave. But he doesn't. He lingers and starts smoking. Again, this is an isolated hill. I'm alone, and now I'm getting scared. I go to hide and plan to wait for my mom, except she just left. Had a few errands to run, and I couldn't reach the phone without the guy seeing me. As I'm trying to figure out what to do, my mom comes home. She runs in and asks if I'm okay. Apparently she got this random "go home now" urge. She hadn't even run her first errand yet, but turned around immediately, found the guy in our yard and asked what he needed. I guess he muttered something about looking for someone or something to that effect, and my mom told him to leave. Apparently he was acting very strangely and made my mom nervous. To this day, I have no idea what he wanted and no idea how my mom knew to come home, but I'm very grateful she did. Oh yeah, trust your gut. When my dad was in his 20s, he was on a trip to the beach with friends, but they only had one car. Yesterday, they all piled into the car to drive home, but Dad got a weird feeling and decided to stay longer and get the bus back, even though it meant his mom would be super mad at him as she had some work for him to do. The car made it all the way back to their hometown and was T-boned in an intersection on the main street. All 4 of his friends in the car died. When I was about 12, my mom randomly woke up one night and suddenly had the urge to check on me for no reason whatsoever. I'd just woken up with nausea and stomach pains when she came into the room, but I hadn't made any noise or called out. Went straight into the hospital where I was in surgery having my appendix out within 2 hours. Mom's intuition is weird and real. Definitely intuition. If she had just left, she had probably driven past this guy and her subconscious registered that there was someone out of place, which gave her an uneasy feeling. I honestly love the concept of intuition. It fascinates me every time I hear a story like this. Have you read The Gift of Fear by Gavin de Becker? I recommend it every time I come across a post like this one. It's about learning to listen to that gut feeling because our bodies and brains are subconsciously noticing stuff that we're not. It was described in one review as a how-to book that reads like a thriller. If the idea of intuition and gut instinct is interesting to you, you'll enjoy this book. Some moms just have that intuition/clairvoyance. I know mine does, and it's freaky. I live 1,000 miles away from my mom, and if I'm having a particularly rough day, she knows, even if I haven't talked to her yet. She'll call and say, "I just had a feeling something was wrong." I'm so glad your mom got that spidey sense. My mom and I are linked too. We share dreams. Hard to explain over text, but I live in a different country now in a completely different time zone, so basically we're never really asleep at the same time. I had a really intense dream one night that I was at my childhood home in Texas and had to be there because our dog needed a sitter. In my dream, I was like, how did I even get here? I'm definitely not going to fly back in time to make it to work tomorrow, lol, but in my dream, I knew I was there to dog sit. I told my mom about the dream a few days later, and she was like, "What night was that?" And I said, "Monday night." And she said, "My dream Sunday night was back at the old house, and I got an emergency work call and had to fly to DC immediately. And I didn't have time to find someone to watch the dog and was really stressed about her being alone." So bizarre. Story 3. Me and my little sister went camping in the woods very close to our house when we were kids. We'd seen this bald guy with a blue shirt and a dog walking around, which isn't unusual for the area. You'll often see people walking and saying hello. For some reason though, I just got this tight feeling in my chest, and my sister must have too, because we both just gave each other this look. I don't know what it was that made me do it. This is very out of character for me, but I took a photo of the back of him as he was walking away. A while later, we see the same guy again near the lake. He comes over and asks about the tent we're carrying, when we'll be setting up, and whether we are camping with our dad. We say yes, we're just going to see him now. A lie. We must have had the same moment of psychicness because we walked off up a fork in the path until we were out of view, then looked at each other and jumped down a path hidden by the bushes and waited behind them on the parallel trail for a bit. The guy watched us walk off, pretended to play with his dog until he couldn't see us, and then turned around and ran up the path after us. Thankfully, he didn't see us hidden and carried up on straight where he thought we'd gone. We decided camping was a bad idea and went home. That evening, my mom showed us a post in the local residents group, which was a picture of the same bald guy trying to break into someone's house. Apparently, he'd just been walking around trying people's front doors and claimed to be a repair guy when he was stopped. I dread to freaking think what his intentions were, but it was very lucky that my sister knew those woods so well, otherwise we wouldn't have thought to go down one of the hidden paths. I got the same feeling a few years ago. I was walking into my parking garage when I felt someone slip in behind me. This wasn't unusual, people often ran in behind each other so they wouldn't have to pull out their keys. But that day, a jolt of terror hit my system. I was already in the building by that point, but I immediately stepped to the side and encouraged him to pass me with my back to the wall, still standing next to the big glass doors in full view of the street and all the people walking around outside, versus getting into the elevator or walking deeper into the garage. The guy didn't break his stride, but we sized each other up as he passed me. I'm a petite woman. He was twice my size and height, street clothes, no briefcase or backpack. I immediately knew he wasn't supposed to be there. He just nodded as he walked past and said, "Hey, how are you doing?" It felt like he was acknowledging I beat him. Have you ever seen wilderness documentaries of lions toying with their prey? When lions miss a zebra, they don't get upset about it, they just kind of go, whatever, and go about their day. The interaction with this guy felt like that. I stood there and watched him cross the length of the parking garage and out another door, back out onto the street. I have good situational awareness. In hindsight, what tipped me off is I distinctly remember him walking down the street behind me and clearly not aiming for the parking garage until I pivoted in that direction. I think about this incident a lot and shudder to think about what would have happened if I had gotten on the elevator. Something similar happened to me, and I didn't remember it until I read your story. I was on vacation with my family and was around 14 years old. We were in a quiet part of a historic city that we were visiting, eating our lunch that we had packed. While we were eating and my dad and little brothers were looking at an old historic building, I noticed a man walking past. He was wearing a blue shirt, had a cap and sunglasses on, and the only reason I noticed him was because he had the kind of same white beard as my grandpa. Nothing weird as of yet, but I saw him a few minutes later again, but now walking in the opposite direction. Okay, maybe he just took a wrong turn. We are ready to leave and go back to the car, so we get up, but pass a church on our way and stop for a minute and look at it and take a picture of it. I wasn't that interested after a while of looking at the building and started looking around, and guess who I saw standing a bit farther away? Yup, the same dude. And I kind of got creeped out. Like, what are the odds? But I tried to rationalize it a bit and thought, maybe he is just here looking at that church as well, even though he looked pretty local. But still, I was trying to keep calm and not freak out for nothing. While I was trying to not freak out over something that was probably nothing, my family started leaving again. The thing was, I was wearing a long skirt that really restricted my leg movement, and I had trouble catching up with them. And I don't know why, but my heart was beating so loud at that moment because I was scared that that man would see his opportunity now and take me while I was separated from my family. One of my brothers, who despite being younger than me was already taller, was closest to me, and I grabbed onto his arm and told him to not let go because I couldn't keep up otherwise. By that time, we had left the historic part of the city and came to a more industrial part, where there were big market stores and a big parking where our car was parked. My parents and brother were already crossing the road, and despite the fact that I hadn't dared to look behind me to see if I was still being followed, I really felt the need to pick up my skirt and run to catch up with them. I don't know why, but I really felt like I couldn't let that guy know that I was creeped out by him, so I didn't dare to run for some reason. My brother and I catch up to the rest of the family, and we go to the right to go to the parking. When we are loading our bags into the car, I look around and I see that exact same man standing in the middle of the road looking at us. Then he turns away and goes in the other direction. I told my parents about that guy in the blue shirt who was walking away and told them that he had been following the exact same route since we were eating. My parents asked me why I didn't tell them earlier, and I said that it could have been a coincidence, but the fact that he followed us all the way to the parking lot, looked at us, and then left was kind of strange. No idea what could have happened, or if it really was all in my head, but I'm just glad I never had to find out. Story 4. I was at a family gathering, basically a reunion, but just for a family within reasonable driving distance, probably 30 people altogether. It was at a country park on a small lake with some grills and buildings, just an empty hall with some picnic tables inside. You could rent for this kind of stuff. The sky started darkening as a storm was approaching, and all the coolers, chairs, balls, and other kids' toys, etc. were brought into the building anticipating the rain. The plan was to wait it out since afternoon showers are common just about every day in the summer. Something in the air just didn't feel or smell right, even though it appeared to be just a regular afternoon storm. The hair on my neck was standing up, and I was in full flight mode. Can't really describe it. The feeling in the pit of my stomach can only be described as absolute dread. I told my wife to take my daughter and get in the car. My brother-in-law took one look at my face and said, "What's wrong?" Apparently, I was white as a ghost. It wasn't even raining yet, and I was full-on panic yelling for everyone to leave. Something wasn't right. No one else was that worried, mostly concerned with how I was acting. I went out to the car, and as soon as I was about to turn the key, the tornado sirens went off. We were not far from wherever they put those, or they're just stupidly loud, because it was deafeningly loud. Now, the rest of the family is pouring out of the building to their cars. Kids crying, and I look across the lake maybe a few miles in the distance and see a funnel cloud. Got the hell out of there, as did everyone else. The building we had rented for this family barbecue thing was completely annihilated. Literally just a slab of concrete and a crap ton of debris all around. It was hit dead on by an EF3. There's something about the air before a tornado. I had a similar experience when I was in high school babysitting 2 young girls. We were in the living room playing next to the big picture window, and I remember looking outside, noticing how it suddenly became very dark and still. I moved them to the other room without windows so they wouldn't get worried. 5 minutes later, my mom texted to make sure that we were inside. The sirens were going off in her hometown about 20 miles away. It was being obliterated. 200-year-old brick churches torn in half. Thankfully, the damage was material. I live in an area where tornadoes aren't common. One day, there was a big storm coming. The Weather Channel is giving a tornado watch, which in the past I never put much stock into. I don't know why, but this time was different. I was sitting in my recliner with my German Shepherd at my feet, watching the news closely. I felt for some reason I should wrangle my cats and put them in their carriers in the basement. Worst case scenario, I figure, nothing happens, and they spent 30 minutes in their carriers. No big deal. I go back to my recliner to continue watching the news when the sky suddenly turns green. Everything feels wrong and surreal. I tell my wife to get in the basement, and I pick up my sheep and carry all 105 pounds of him, kicking and screaming down the narrow basement steps. My feet hit the basement floor and the pressure suddenly drops. We hear a thunderous roar and the windows upstairs shatter. It felt like an eternity in the 30 seconds it lasted. Then there was nothing. I creep upstairs and peek out the basement door to find every window blown out. The recliner where I had been sitting not 3 minutes prior was completely covered in shards of glass, which I would have taken to the face if I hadn't hauled ass. It turns out the tornado went directly over our house. Windows were destroyed, the roof was destroyed, the fence completely gone, the porch was ripped from the house, the trees were down absolutely everywhere. I'll never forget how something in my gut said to take it seriously, and listening to it saved my life. That's insane, but I fully understand that feeling. When I was 8, my family was driving home from our summer holidays. My sister was only a few months old, and my parents were definitely tired and wanted to get home as quickly as possible. While we were driving, it started pouring. At the same time, I was unbelievably carsick and begging for my parents to pull over. My dad pulled into a Tim Hortons, and my mom took me inside to the bathroom. I remember not throwing up. My mom being annoyed that we had to stop just for me to not be sick, and then trying to find my dad's car in the downpour. We got back in the car and back on the road. Both my parents did not believe I was sick. Not even 5 minutes later, we're back on our route and the road is an absolute mess. Trees and debris are everywhere. My dad pulled over to talk to someone in a truck and he said, "You just missed it. A tornado just blew right through here." You missed it by seconds. My parents changed tune and just knew I must have sensed something that day. Story 5. Wednesday midday runs along a beautiful river pathway near my apartment block. About 1 kilometer in, I felt people watching me and directly turned around and ran home, even though I did not see anybody. Closed the 2 magnetic gates leading up to my door and didn't see anybody around or follow me. About 10 minutes later, 2 guys were at my front door trying to push it in. I was luckily on the other side of the door at that moment and pushed it back closed with all my force and began screaming. I managed to securely lock the front door and text my apartment block for help. I was on the 2nd floor, so they obviously watched which apartment I went into. Looking back at the apartment's security cameras, they were able to see the 2 guys pull apart the magnetic security gates, 2 of them. The block then quickly changed the gates to a mechanic lock that cannot be pulled apart. I feel like there is some kind of undiscovered quantum-sized mechanism that allows us to feel when someone is looking at us. Our body has its own double-slit mechanism that lets us know we are being watched. The theory is that our brain picks up on inputs that we don't consciously notice, but that it subconsciously processes based on known paradigms and communicates that information to our consciousness as a bad feeling. Things like the body language of a person, movement patterns, a bush/branch or rustle, inconsistent with the wind, a shadow moving just out of sight, a smile that isn't quite right, lots of little bits of information that correlate with prior negative experiences that we aren't actively aware of, but that our brains catalog. You'll actually notice it quite a bit if you spend a lot of time outdoors. Things like knowing it's going to rain soon will just pop into your head before you actively notice the signs of an incoming rainstorm. Or if you spend a lot of time on the water, the same thing. You start being able to read the water at a glance. Our brains are pretty incredible. A lot of those are animal noises that we subconsciously filter out. Since moving out of the center of the city, I can tell when we're in abnormal weather because there's an eerie quiet. I suspect the same thing works for people lurking. Birds and other critters don't react the same to someone jogging as they do to someone lurking. Or maybe OP noticed that instead of quieting on their approach, the animals were already quiet. Could even be that the noises were just different noises. It's easy to not notice those when they're normal and easy to not realize what's different until it's pointed out. But once you start paying close attention to the wildlife noises around you, they can really tell you a lot. This seems like the most practical answer. We have white noise machines at work which are on 24/7. Nobody ever noticed them. I sure didn't. It just seemed like a little AC noise, nothing that would block out any noise. We're in cubicles and you can't really hear what people in the cubicle next to you are saying. One day they shut them off and holy crap, it was eerily quiet and you could hear everyone's conversation. We all just had to not make any calls because of how distracting it was. If I would have walked in with them off, I would have instantly known something was off, but wouldn't quite be able to put my finger on it. Story 6. I bartended, and years ago I kicked this guy out because he was acting very strange. Muttering under his breath that he would kill my other customers, just really hostile. He had missing fingers on one hand and he was kind of a bigger guy. After the bar closed, I was almost finished counting money, so like an hour after everyone left, and I was just about to leave, and I had that gut feeling. I looked out the window and that guy was standing on the corner watching me in a ski mask. I know it was him because of the build. As soon as I grabbed my phone, he took off, but the cops knew who he was. Now he has a vendetta out against me and he's well known around town. He's nuts. Wow, I'm glad you trusted your gut. My childhood friend's dad was murdered when we were kids in a similar situation. He managed a bar and had kicked out a young man earlier in the night for being underage. The guy left and ended up waiting outside for hours until everyone had left, and my friend's dad was closing up the bar. He was shot to death in the parking lot. It was so incredibly senseless, but I guess the guy was on a kind of murder spree and had also killed a few other random people over the span of a few weeks until he was caught. Story 7. I was freshly married in my early 20s, living in Fallbrook, California. My husband, ex, was a Marine and was at work, and I was driving home from visiting family further south. In order to get into Fallbrook, you have to travel along this long, dark, and windy street called Mission Road. It's already a super dark night, about 11 p.m., and it's a little foggy as well. I'm slowing down and coming around this slight bend in the road, and all of a sudden the hair goes up on my neck and I feel incredibly anxious. About 5 seconds later, a young woman jumps out of the brush directly ahead of me, maybe 50 feet away, on the left-hand side of the road, while waving her arms in the air and gesturing frantically for me to pull over. I swerved a bit to the right, slowing down even further, but I did not stop. She was young, maybe early 20s or even late teens, and a little dirty, and I was immediately conflicted over continuing to drive, but something told me not to stop under any circumstances. I got further up the road, slowed a little more, and dialed 911 with one shaky hand. The dispatcher said she'd send someone to go check, but encouraged me not to feel badly. Apparently, there had already been calls about this girl over the last hour, and they were unable to find her when police showed up. I heard a few weeks later about some carjacking/robbery attempts in the area. Very relieved I listened to my instincts that night. I freaking hate this so much. It takes advantage of every instinct we've been raised with to help others in need, and of course the damage it does in general to trust and empathy. Screw anyone who has ever done this. The extra part of "I took advantage of your willingness to be a good person" should carry an extra punishment in my honest opinion. My brother is this type of person. Not carjacking people, but he has no problems stealing from people and lying to people. He literally told my mom years ago that if a person trusted him or whatever, then they deserved it. Like, F off. I don't have a relationship with him anymore, haven't for years. He's the reason I have horrible trust issues, and for a long time I always automatically assumed that the person was lying to me. Unfortunately, I think you'll find that nearly all people who rob or kill have a tendency to take advantage of people's good nature. A huge part of criminality relies on manipulation. There was a really interesting study of a serial killer victim, and it found that a super significant number of female victims were known to be helpful, kind to strangers, and always willing to lend a hand. The same kind of person who would help Ted Bundy load some furniture into the back of a van, for instance. I had a similar but at the same time very different experience in Texas many years ago. I was driving home one night around 11 p.m. as well. A woman with blonde hair was flagging me down with a ripped t-shirt. She was wearing a bra and holding the t-shirt over her chest. I pulled about 300 feet ahead of her to the only streetlight for at least a quarter mile. She was rapidly approaching my truck, and I shouted back at her to stop and tell me what was going on. It turns out that she had been kidnapped at her house, robbed, raped, and left tied to a tree just off the highway. She had managed to untie herself, and that's when I drove by. They caught the guys that did it, and I was a witness for the prosecution. Story 8. I was at the state fair with my mom and best friend. A friend and I were looking at rides and the games. This creepy guy and his blonde girlfriend kept babbling at us about taking headshots, and that he was a modeling agent. He just seemed off and really sleazy, and the girl was giving me the creeps, so I pretended that I saw my mom telling us to come and grabbed my friend and dragged her off. She was close to 5'8", and not a small girl at 13 years old. I was 4'9" and around 65 pounds at 14 years old. A few days later, there was a news story and rumors going around the school about 2 girls being kidnapped, assaulted, and murdered. They were taken from the fair the same day that we were there, just a few hours later. The creepy couple were Gerald and Charlene Gallegos, serial killers. Story 9. I was 12 at the time, and my favorite thing in the world was spending the night at my grandma's house. We lived in the sticks at the time, and my grandma lived closer to the nearest town. Thursday night was grandma's night. I felt something off one Thursday night and asked my mom if I could just stay home with my mom and dad. They reluctantly agreed. I went home, watched some TV, and went to bed. My bedroom was on the adjoining wall of the living room. I wasn't really asleep, but I heard my mom keep saying my dad's name over and over again with a hint of panic. I sneak out to the living room, and my dad is on the couch with his head tilted back, snoring really loud, which wasn't uncommon, but my mom was beside him, shaking him and telling him to wake up. She yelled at me to go back to bed. I obviously didn't. I snuck to their bedroom to call 911. I told the dispatcher that my dad was asleep and my mom was trying to shake him awake, but she couldn't. Eventually, the phone call went to the living room and my mom talked to the dispatcher. They sent an ambulance to the middle of nowhere. My dad had taken a bottle of diazepam to try to commit suicide. I remember sitting on the floor and holding his hand and repeating over and over that I loved him. The ambulance came and took him to the hospital, lights and sirens the whole way. We didn't know what happened during that time, but we found out a day or so later, and that is when our world changed. I am very sure if I did not call 911 that night, that my dad would have succeeded, and it would have probably driven my mom over the edge as well. And I have no idea why I didn't want to stay the night at my nanny's. I just had a feeling that I needed to go home. Thanks for watching until the end. If you have a similar story to these that you would like to share with us, please leave it in the comments below. If you enjoyed this video, please leave us a like and subscribe if you haven't. For more videos like this one right now, please stop by our channel. Thanks again, and see you next time.